Why did they call her Gun Girl, like it was something shameful? The cafeteria fell silent when Martinez walked past their table, not the respectful kind of quiet, the kind that cut through your chest and made you wish you could disappear. She kept her eyes forward, tray balanced in steady hands that never shook, even when the whispers started. Maybe if she spent less time playing with guns and more time learning to be a normal girl. Sarah, head cheerleader. Perfect teeth, perfect life, perfect cruelty wrapped in designer clothes and fake concern. The words hit like bullets but had learned something her tormentors never would. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. She found her usual table in the corner. Alone. Always alone. But solitude had taught her things these kids would never understand. While they chased approval and fleeting popularity, she was mastering something eternal. Something that would matter when high school became a distant memory and the real world demanded more than pretty smiles and social media followers. Her grandfather Carlos would pick her up after school like always. His weathered Ford truck a sanctuary from the judgment of teenagers who mistook different for wrong. The drive to his ranch stretched through rolling Texas hills, each mile putting distance between, and a world that couldn't see past its own narrow definitions of what a girl should be. How was school? His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough of life to know that high school cruelty was temporary, but the lessons learned from it could last forever. Same as always, abuelo. He glanced at her in the mirror, understanding everything she didn't say. Carlos Martinez had spent 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine sniper. He'd seen young people face challenges that would break most adults. His granddaughter's quiet dignity reminded him of the best soldiers he'd known, those who endured without complaint, who found strength in discipline rather than approval. The ranch appeared around a bend, familiar and welcoming. 50 acres of Texas landscape where could be herself without apology. Here, her steady hands and sharp eyes weren't strange. They were gifts waiting to be refined. "Ready to work?" Carlos asked as they pulled up to the gun range he'd built behind the barn. Was already reaching for her rifle case. A modified hunting rifle her grandfather had spent months perfecting, teaching her that excellence required both natural ability and countless hours of dedicated practice. The gun felt right in her hands, an extension of her will and focus. But today, something was different. As she settled into her shooting position, noticed her grandfather watching her with unusual intensity, like he was evaluating more than just her marksmanship. "What's wrong, abuelo?" "Nothing's wrong, but I think it's time we had a conversation about your future." The words hung in the air like the Texas heat. Change was coming. She could feel it in the way her grandfather studied her form, the way he nodded when she placed shot after perfect shot into targets that would challenge experienced marksmen. 3 months later, everything would be different. But that afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Martinez was still just the girl they called Gun Girl. The girl who ate lunch alone and walked through hallways like she was invisible. She had no idea that her grandfather had already made phone calls, that her shooting scores and academic records were sitting on desks hundreds of miles away, that people she'd never met were discussing her potential in rooms where decisions were made about the future of America's military capabilities. The transformation had already begun. She just didn't know it yet. As twilight settled over the ranch, cleaned her rifle with the methodical precision her grandfather had taught her. Each component received attention, respect, care. The routine calmed her mind and centered her focus. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and isolation, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. Her phone buzzed with a text from a classmate asking for help with calculus homework. The same classmate who pretended not to know her in the hallways, but needed her intelligence when grades mattered. Stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. She was done being used by people who couldn't be bothered to acknowledge her humanity. In the distance, Coyotes called to each other across the darkening landscape, listened to their wild song, and understood something her classmates never would. Sometimes the strongest among us run alone, not because they can't find a pack, but because they're preparing for a journey others can't imagine. The military recruiter would arrive at her school in 6 weeks. Her grandfather's former commanding officer, now stationed at Fort Benning, would receive a very interesting phone call tomorrow morning. And somewhere in the Pentagon, a file was being prepared for a program so selective that most people never learned it existed. But that night, Martinez went to sleep in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the same posters and memories she'd always known. The girl who would one day set a world record for long-range precision shooting was still just a teenager who wanted to belong somewhere. She had no idea that belonging would come, just not in any way she'd ever imagined. The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., but was already awake. She'd been staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes, thinking about the recruiter who'd spoken at their school assembly yesterday. Sergeant First Class Williams. His words about the Army's sniper program had ignited something in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Hope maybe, or destiny calling. Her classmates had barely paid attention during his presentation, too busy texting and whispering about weekend plans, but had hung on every word, especially when he mentioned the selection process for advanced marksmanship training, the precision required, the mental discipline, the way he described shooting as both art and science. After breakfast, she found her grandfather in his workshop, cleaning his old service rifle, the same M40 he'd carried through the jungles of Southeast Asia, modified over decades of careful attention. "Abuelo, I need to ask you something." Carlos looked up, seeing something in her expression that made him set down his cleaning rod and give her his complete attention. The recruiter yesterday, he mentioned programs for people with advanced shooting skills. Her grandfather's weathered face remained neutral, but caught the slight tightening around his eyes, like he'd been expecting this conversation. "What exactly did he tell you?" "He said the Army looks for individuals with exceptional marksmanship abilities, people who understand the science behind precision shooting, not just the mechanics." Carlos nodded slowly. He'd known this day would come, had been preparing for it since the first time he'd watched his granddaughter shoot with the focus of a master craftsman. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were different battles entirely. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing. I wanted to talk to you first." The honesty in her voice made Carlos smile despite the weight settling in his chest. His granddaughter had grown into someone who understood loyalty, respect, and the importance of family counsel. The military would recognize these qualities immediately. "You know I'll support whatever decision you make, but I need you to understand what you're considering." They spent the morning at the shooting range, but today the session felt different, more like evaluation than practice. Carlos watched as engaged targets at distances that challenged his own abilities, her movements economical and precise. No wasted motion, no uncertainty. At 1,200 meters, with wind gusting from the northwest, her shot found the center ring, again. "You're ready for training I can't provide." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Carlos had taught her everything his Marine Corps experience could offer, but his granddaughter had surpassed the limits of what civilian training could achieve. She needed access to equipment, instruction, and challenges that only the military could provide. That evening found herself on the front porch, staring at the stars and thinking about futures she'd never seriously considered. A year ago, her biggest concern was surviving high school without losing her mind. Now she was contemplating a path that could lead places she couldn't fully comprehend. Her phone rang. "Sarah." "Hey, I know we don't really talk, but I heard you talking to that Army guy after the assembly. You're not seriously considering joining the military, are you?" The question carried layers of assumption that made his jaw tighten, like her choices were somehow subject to Sarah's approval. Why would that concern you? I mean, it's just, you're smart enough for college. You could do something normal with your life instead of playing soldier. Playing soldier. The phrase revealed everything needed to know about how Sarah viewed military service. As a game, a fantasy, something people did when they weren't capable of real success. Thanks for the concern, Sarah, but I can handle my own decisions. She ended the call without waiting for a response. 3 days later, Sergeant Williams returned to meet with personally. Her grandfather had made the call, setting up a meeting that would determine whether his granddaughter was genuinely ready for the path she was considering. The sergeant arrived at the ranch with a spotting scope and military-grade rangefinder, equipment that made Carlos whistle appreciatively. "Sergeant Martinez, your granddaughter tells me she's interested in advanced marksmanship programs. Mind if I see what she can do?" What followed was less demonstration than revelation. Shot after shot at distances that pushed civilian equipment to its limits, performed with consistency that made Sergeant Williams recalculate his understanding of what was possible from someone her age. "How long have you been shooting at these distances, miss?" "About 3 years seriously. My grandfather taught me that understanding your equipment completely is more important than rushing to longer ranges." The sergeant made notes in a tactical notebook, documenting not just her accuracy but her approach to each shot, the way she read wind conditions, her patience between shots, the technical language she used to describe ballistic calculations. This wasn't a talented amateur. This was someone with instinctive understanding of concepts that took most people years to master. As they packed equipment, Sergeant Williams made his offer. "Miss Martinez, the Army has programs specifically designed for individuals with your level of skill. The selection process is rigorous, and the training is among the most challenging in the military. But if you're serious about developing your abilities to their full potential." Looked at her grandfather, seeing pride mixed with concern in his expression. He'd spent his entire adult life in service to his country. He understood both the honor and the cost of the path his granddaughter was considering. What would the timeline look like? Graduate high school first. The program requires emotional maturity as much as technical skill, but if you're still interested after graduation, I can arrange for advanced evaluation. That night lay in bed thinking about a conversation that had changed everything. 6 months ago, she was just the weird girl who spent too much time at shooting ranges. Now she was considering a future that could transform her into something she'd never imagined. But first, she had to survive the rest of senior year. How do you concentrate on calculus when your future is calling from 1,000 miles away? Stared at the differential equations covering her homework sheet, but her mind kept drifting to ballistic trajectories and wind compensation. Senior year had become an exercise in patience, marking time, until she could begin the real work of becoming who she was meant to be. Mrs., her AP Physics teacher, noticed the change immediately. "Miss Martinez, you seem distracted lately. Everything all right?" "Just thinking about college applications," replied, which wasn't technically a lie. She was thinking about her future, just not the kind Mrs. assumed. The lie felt necessary. How do you explain to a high school teacher that you're considering a path so specialized that most people don't know it exists? That while your classmates debate between state universities and private colleges, you're researching military occupational specialties and selection criteria for programs with graduation rates below 30%. Her grandfather understood the weight of keeping such significant decisions private. During their evening sessions at the ranch, he shared stories about his own journey from Texas farm boy to Marine sniper, helping understand that transformation rarely happens in ways others can predict or understand. "When I enlisted, my own family thought I was making a mistake. They wanted me to work the farm, marry a local girl, live the life they could understand. But some people are called to serve in ways that don't fit conventional expectations. His words provided comfort during increasingly difficult weeks at school. Her classmates were caught up in senior year traditions, homecoming, college visits, scholarship applications, while felt like she was living in two different worlds. One foot in the familiar rhythms of high school, the other reaching towards something entirely unknown. The isolation intensified when college acceptance letters began arriving. Students celebrated acceptances to prestigious universities while remained silent about her plans. She'd applied to several colleges as backup options, but her heart was already committed to a different path. "So where are you planning to go?" Jennifer asked during lunch. Jennifer had been one of the few classmates who occasionally showed genuine friendliness, though they'd never been close. "I'm still deciding between options," answered carefully. "Come on, with your grades you could get into anywhere. My mom said you scored perfect on the SAT math section. You must have some amazing opportunities." The assumption stung because it revealed how little her classmates understood about different definitions of opportunity. Yes, her academic record could open doors to excellent universities, but none of those institutions could provide what she was really seeking: the chance to push her abilities to their absolute limits in service of something larger than herself. That afternoon received a call that changed everything. "Miss Martinez, this is Colonel Hayes calling from Fort Benning. Sergeant Williams forwarded your information to my office. I understand you're interested in advanced marksmanship programs." His pulse quickened. Colonel Hayes was legendary within military circles, one of the first women to successfully complete the Army's most demanding sniper training programs. Her voice carried authority earned through years of proving herself in a field dominated by men. "Yes, ma'am. I've been training with my grandfather, and Sergeant Williams suggested I might be qualified for specialized programs." "Your grandfather is Carlos Martinez, formerly Staff Sergeant Martinez, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." "Yes, ma'am. I served with several Marines who knew your grandfather's reputation. If you've inherited even a fraction of his abilities, you'd be a valuable addition to our programs." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Colonel Hayes explained selection criteria, training timelines, and the level of commitment required for programs was considering. More importantly, she described the opportunities available to individuals who successfully completed advanced training, assignments and responsibilities that could shape military capabilities for decades. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. Very few people have the combination of natural ability, mental discipline, and educational background we're looking for. If you're serious about this path, I can arrange for evaluation immediately after your high school graduation." "I'm serious, ma'am." "Good. Expect paperwork within 2 weeks. And Miss Martinez, don't let anyone convince you that this choice is somehow less valuable than traditional college paths. The military needs intelligent, capable people who can think strategically while operating under pressure. Your country needs people like you." After ending the call, sat in her bedroom, staring at acceptance letters from 3 different universities. Full scholarships, academic honors programs, opportunities her classmates would envy. But none of them called to her the way Colonel Hayes's voice had. None of them offered the chance to discover the absolute limits of her capabilities. 2 weeks later, the paperwork arrived. Military application forms, medical evaluation requirements, security clearance documentation. The process was more complex than any college application, requiring detailed information about her background, motivations, and long-term goals. Filled out each form with careful attention to detail, understanding that this paperwork represented the first step toward a complete transformation of her life. No more hiding her interests. No more pretending to fit into boxes that were too small for her ambitions. Her grandfather helped review the completed application, his pride evident as he read her responses to questions about leadership experience, technical knowledge, and commitment to service. You've grown into someone I'm honored to call family. Whatever challenges lie ahead, you're ready for them. The application packet went into the mail on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, had received confirmation that her materials were being reviewed by selection boards she'd probably never meet. 3 months until graduation. 3 months of maintaining the facade of being just another high school student while preparing for a future none of her classmates could imagine. But something had changed in how she carried herself through the hallways. The whispers and sideways glances that had once cut so deeply now seemed insignificant. She was no longer the girl they called Gun Girl with mockery and dismissal. She was becoming something else entirely. Friday afternoon brought news that would accelerate everything. Colonel Hayes called with an offer that made hands shake with anticipation. Miss Martinez, based on your application and Sergeant Williams's evaluation, we'd like to invite you to participate in a preliminary assessment next month. If you perform well, we can expedite your training timeline significantly. What would that involve, ma'am? Advanced marksmanship evaluation, psychological assessment, physical fitness testing, and interviews with senior training personnel. Essentially, we want to determine whether you're ready to begin specialized training immediately after graduation rather than starting with basic combat training. The offer was unprecedented. Most candidates spent months in general military training before being considered for advanced programs. But the combination of skills, education, and maturity had caught the attention of people who made exceptions only for truly exceptional candidates. That evening, as she shared the news with her grandfather, realized her high school experience was effectively over. While her classmates prepared for prom and senior skip day, she would be preparing for evaluations that would determine whether she was ready to join the most elite marksmen in the United States military. The girl who had eaten lunch alone and endured years of mockery was about to discover just how far quiet determination and relentless preparation could take someone willing to walk a different path. But first, she had to prove she belonged there. What does it feel like to hold your entire future in your hands at 17 years old? Martinez stood at the gate of a military installation that wasn't supposed to exist on any map, clutching orders that had arrived in a manila envelope marked confidential. 3 weeks had passed since Colonel Hayes's phone call, 3 weeks of preparation that felt simultaneously too long and nowhere near enough. The morning evaluation began before sunrise. Found herself in a stark briefing room with 2 other candidates, both male, both older, both looking at her with poorly concealed skepticism. She was accustomed to being underestimated, but the stakes felt different here. This wasn't high school social dynamics. These men would potentially serve alongside her in situations where doubt could cost lives. Candidates will complete marksmanship evaluation, psychological assessment, and tactical scenario testing, announced Major Sarah, the evaluation officer whose reputation preceded her. Had been part of the first generation of women in combat roles, earning respect through performance that silenced critics and opened doors for others. The marksmanship portion began with conventional distances and gradually extended to ranges that pushed both equipment and human capabilities. Watch the other candidates perform competently, their shots accurate but unremarkable. When her turn came, she approached the firing line with the quiet confidence her grandfather had instilled through years of patient instruction. The first target stood at 800 meters, standard for advanced marksmen, though challenging enough to eliminate casual shooters. Shot struck dead center. The second target, at 1,000 meters, received the same treatment. When they moved to 1,200 meters, a distance that separated good shooters from exceptional ones, She took extra time to read wind conditions and calculate adjustments. The bullet found its mark with mechanical precision. Major made notes without visible reaction, but caught the slight widening of her eyes when the spotter confirmed another perfect hit. Through her peripheral vision, she noticed the other candidates watching with grudging respect instead of skepticism. "Miss Martinez," Major called, "are you comfortable attempting shots at extended range?" "Yes, ma'am. What distance did you have in mind?" They moved the target to 1,500 meters, well beyond the effective range of most sniper systems, and into territory where environmental factors became exponentially more complex. Wind speed and direction at multiple points along the bullet's path, temperature variations affecting powder burn rates, even barometric pressure influencing trajectory calculations. Settled into her shooting position and began the complex mental calculations required for such an extreme shot. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Shooting isn't just about pulling a trigger. It's about understanding the bullet's journey before it even leaves the barrel. The shot required nearly 5 minutes of preparation as read environmental conditions and made microscopic adjustments to her scope. When she finally fired, the bullet's flight time seemed eternal, though it lasted only seconds. "Direct hit," the spotter confirmed, voice carrying surprised admiration. Major's poker face cracked slightly. In 15 years of conducting evaluations, she'd seen perhaps 3 candidates make that shot on their first attempt under test conditions. The psychological evaluation proved more challenging than the marksmanship assessment. Dr. Roberts, the program's consulting psychologist, had developed screening methods specifically designed to identify individuals who could handle the unique stresses of precision long-range operations. "Tell me about a time when you faced significant adversity," Dr. Roberts began, her voice carefully neutral. Considered the question carefully. She could discuss the social isolation of high school, the challenge of being different in a community that valued conformity. But something told her that superficial answers wouldn't satisfy someone whose job was identifying psychological resilience. "When I was 15, I missed a shot during a training session with my grandfather. It was a routine target at 600 meters, well within my capabilities, but I rushed the preparation and failed to account for wind changes. The miss itself wasn't significant, everyone misses shots, but my reaction concerned me." "How did you react?" "I was angry. Not frustrated or disappointed, but genuinely angry at the equipment, the conditions, even my grandfather for not providing better wind readings. The intensity of my emotional response worried me because it suggested I was losing the mental discipline that separates good shooters from mediocre ones." Dr. Roberts leaned forward slightly, intrigued by self-awareness. "How did you address this concern?" "I spent the next 6 months working specifically on emotional regulation during shooting sessions. My grandfather would deliberately introduce stressors, unexpected noises, time pressure, equipment problems, while I practiced maintaining focus and composure. The goal wasn't to eliminate emotional responses, but to prevent them from affecting performance." "And did this training prove effective?" "Yes, ma'am. I learned that true mental discipline isn't about feeling nothing. It's about feeling everything while maintaining perfect control of your actions." The answer revealed psychological sophistication that impressed Dr. Roberts. Most 17-year-olds lack the self-awareness to recognize their emotional patterns, much less develop systematic approaches to managing them. The tactical scenario testing pushed candidates to apply their skills under simulated combat stress. Each person faced complex situations requiring quick decision-making, precise shooting, and strategic thinking under time pressure. Scenario involved a hostage situation with multiple potential targets, limited information about friendly and enemy personnel, and environmental conditions that complicated accurate shooting. The setup was designed to test not just marksmanship but judgment under pressure. She spent precious minutes analyzing the situation before taking action, an approach that concerned the observing instructors. In combat, hesitation could prove fatal, but when finally moved, her decisions were methodical and precise. Rather than engaging targets immediately, she repositioned to an angle that provided clearer sight lines and reduced the risk of civilian casualties. Her first shot eliminated a high-priority target at maximum range. Her second shot, taken immediately afterward, neutralized a threat that other candidates had failed to identify. Time, called the range officer, had completed the scenario faster than either of the other candidates while achieving better results. More importantly, her approach demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed veteran instructors accustomed to evaluating combat veterans. During the debrief session, Major addressed all three candidates but focused particular attention on performance. Miss Martinez, your technical skills are obviously exceptional, but what impressed our evaluation team most was your tactical thinking. You didn't just react to the scenario. You analyzed it strategically and developed an approach that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risks. Thank you, ma'am. My grandfather always emphasized that shooting is just one component of successful operations. Understanding the broader tactical situation is equally important. Your grandfather taught you well. That evening, while waiting for evaluation results, called home to share the day's experiences with her grandfather. Carlos listened quietly as she described each phase of testing, his pride evident even through the phone connection. Whatever the results, you've already proven something important to yourself. You've shown that all our training prepared you for challenges most people your age couldn't handle. But what if I don't get selected? What if this was just preparation for disappointment? Then you'll find another path that utilizes your abilities. But I don't think you need to worry about that. You've become everything I hoped you could be and more than I ever imagined possible. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Miss Martinez, Major announced during the final briefing, based on your evaluation performance, we're prepared to offer you immediate entry into advanced training programs typically reserved for candidates with several years of military experience. This is not a decision we make lightly. The offer exceeded most optimistic expectations. Instead of starting with basic combat training like most new recruits, she would begin specialized instruction immediately after high school graduation. However, Major continued, I need you to understand what you're accepting. The training is designed to push candidates beyond what they believe are their limits. The physical demands are significant, but the psychological pressures are even more challenging. Many excellent soldiers don't complete these programs. I understand, ma'am. I'm ready for whatever challenges are required. We believe you are. Report to Fort Benning on June 15th for the beginning of what will likely be the most demanding experience of your life. As drove away from the evaluation facility, she reflected on a day that had transformed possibility into reality. The girl who had been mocked as Gun Girl was about to join the most elite marksmen in the United States military. But first, she had to return to high school and pretend that nothing had changed. The hardest part wouldn't be the military training. It would be maintaining the facade of being just another teenager for 3 more months while preparing for a future that would redefine everything she understood about her own capabilities. Graduation day arrived with Texas sunshine and the kind of heat that made everyone move a little slower, except for Martinez, who stood at the edge of the football field wondering how she'd survived 18 years in a place that had never understood her. The ceremony felt surreal, names being called alphabetically, students crossing a stage to receive diplomas that represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. For most of her classmates, next meant college orientations and summer jobs. For It meant reporting to Fort Benning in 6 days for training that would transform her into something no one in this small Texas town could imagine. Martinez. She walked across the stage in the same steady, controlled manner that had carried her through years of isolation and mockery. Principal Williams shook her hand and smiled the same generic smile he'd given the previous 200 graduates. He had no idea he was handing a diploma to someone who would soon set military records and redefine what was possible in precision marksmanship. From the bleachers, her grandfather's proud smile the stadium lights. Carlos had watched his granddaughter transform from an awkward 12-year-old into a young woman capable of things that would challenge men twice her age with decades more experience. The uniform she'd wear next week would suit her better than any graduation gown. Sarah approached after the ceremony, her expression carrying the nervous energy of someone trying to repair years of casual cruelty with a few minutes of forced friendliness. "Hey, can you believe we actually made it? So what are your plans for college?" The question everyone had been asking. The one had learned to deflect with vague responses about keeping her options open. But standing there in her graduation cap, with military orders folded in her purse, and a future most people couldn't comprehend stretching ahead of her, she decided the time for deflection had passed. "I'm not going to college, Sarah. I'm joining the Army." The admission hung between them like a physical barrier. Sarah's face cycled through expressions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been respect before settling on the condescending concern that had characterized their relationship for years. "The Army? You're way too smart for that. I mean, you could get scholarships to amazing schools." "I'm smart enough to make my own choices about what constitutes an amazing opportunity." The reply was delivered in the same calm, controlled tone had perfected during years of enduring Sarah's casual cruelty. No anger, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty that needed no external validation. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, probably with some variation of "I was just trying to help," but something in its expression discouraged further commentary. Instead, she offered a weak smile and drifted away toward classmates who would provide more agreeable conversation. Watching Sarah retreat felt a profound sense of closure. The girl who had once made her feel small and ashamed of her interests was now irrelevant to her future. In 6 days, would be surrounded by people who understood dedication, discipline, and the pursuit of excellence. People who measured worth by capability rather than social conformity. Her grandfather approached as the crowd began to thin, his pride evident in every step. "Ready to go home. Ready to leave, abuelo. But I think home is going to be somewhere else from now on." Carlos nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Home wasn't just a place. It was where you could be your authentic self without apology or explanation. For someone with unique combination of abilities and ambitions, home might be found among warriors rather than in the familiar comfort of family ranch. That evening, as packed for military training, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a lonely teenager whose only confidence came from hitting targets that others found impossible. Now she was preparing to join an elite community of professionals whose standards would challenge everything she thought she understood about her own limits. The packing process felt ritualistic. Civilian clothes that would be replaced by military uniforms. Personal items that would need to fit in regulation containers. Books about ballistics and tactical theory that had sustained her through high school now seemed like elementary texts compared to the training she was about to receive. Her phone buzzed with text messages from classmates sharing college orientations and summer plans. Beaches and parties and internships that belonged to a world she was leaving behind. Read each message carefully, understanding that these connections were ending. Not from anger or resentment, but because her path was diverging so dramatically from theirs that shared experiences would become impossible. She drafted responses to several messages, then deleted them all. What could she say? That while they were choosing dormitory roommates, she was preparing for training designed to transform her into a precision weapon. That their biggest concerns, professors and textbooks and social dynamics, would soon seem trivial compared to the responsibilities she was accepting. Instead, she turned off her phone and spent her last evening at home with her grandfather, reviewing lessons that had prepared her for this moment. Remember, everything I taught you about shooting applies to military service. Patience, discipline, understanding that real mastery comes from respecting both the weapon and the responsibility it represents. They sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge in the clear Texas sky. The same stars she'd looked at for 18 years, but tonight they seemed different. Tonight they illuminated a path toward something extraordinary. "Are you afraid?" Carlos asked gently. "Yes," admitted, "but not of the training or the challenges. I'm afraid of discovering that I'm not as capable as I think I am, that all this preparation was just practice for a life I'm not actually qualified to live." Fear like that is wisdom, not weakness. The people who should worry are those too arrogant to question their own abilities. His words provided comfort, but understood that the real test would come when she was surrounded by instructors whose job was finding her breaking point and pushing her past it. All the encouragement in the world wouldn't matter if she couldn't perform when performance determined whether she earned the right to continue. June 15th arrived with pre-dawn darkness and the kind of nervous energy that made sitting still impossible. Carlos drove her to the airport, their conversation light and practical: flight details, reporting instructions, contact information for emergencies. Neither wanted to acknowledge that this goodbye marked the end of one phase of their relationship and the beginning of something completely different. At the airport security checkpoint, hugged her grandfather with the fierce intensity of someone who understood that the person returning home in a few months would be fundamentally changed by experiences he could only imagine. "Make me proud." "I will, abuelo. Everything I become starts with what you taught me." On the plane to Atlanta, sat surrounded by civilians discussing vacation plans and business meetings, people whose biggest daily challenge might be choosing between restaurants or finding parking spaces. She listened to their conversations and realized how completely her perspective had shifted. 3 hours later, she stepped off the plane into humidity that hit like a physical wall and heat that made Texas summers seem mild by comparison. Fort Benning, Georgia, the place where she would either prove herself worthy of the opportunities she'd been given or discover that dreams sometimes exceed capabilities. But as she collected her luggage and prepared to report for the most challenging experience of her life, Martinez felt ready. Years of patient preparation, months of mental conditioning, and a lifetime of being underestimated had created someone capable of extraordinary things. The girl they'd called Gun Girl was about to become something the small minds of her could never have imagined. The transformation was about to begin. Why do drill sergeants always seem to know exactly which words will cut deepest? "Martinez, where the hell do you think you learned to shoot summer camp?" Drill Sergeant Jackson's voice carried across the firing range like a whip crack, designed to shatter confidence and expose weakness in candidates who might fold under pressure, but had spent years developing immunity to verbal assault, learning from her grandfather that true strength spoke through performance rather than response. She adjusted her position slightly, controlled her breathing, and placed another shot dead center in a target that was giving other candidates trouble. The quiet precision of her shooting became a statement more powerful than any verbal comeback could have been. Fort Benning's advanced training program was unlike anything had experienced, even in her most optimistic imagination. The other candidates were career soldiers with multiple deployments, combat veterans whose experience dwarfed her civilian background. She was the youngest person in the program by at least 5 years, the only woman in a group of 12, and the only candidate who had never served in regular military units. Staff Sergeant Williams, one of the program instructors, had initially questioned the wisdom of accepting someone so inexperienced into training designed for elite operators. His skepticism was professional rather than personal, but it created an atmosphere where had to prove herself worthy of every opportunity. The first week nearly broke her. Not physically, years of training with her grandfather had prepared her body for the demands of military conditioning, but the psychological pressure of being constantly evaluated, constantly questioned, constantly required to justify her presence among men who had earned their positions through combat experience, created stress unlike anything she had faced. Martinez explained to me why a teenager who's never heard a shot fired in anger thinks she belongs in this program. Staff Sergeant Williams demanded during a particularly brutal training session. The question was designed to provoke an emotional response, to see if she would crack under pressure or respond with the kind of defensive anger that revealed psychological weakness. Had learned from her grandfather that such moments required absolute honesty delivered with unshakable composure. Staff Sergeant, I don't think I belong here. I know I belong here because my performance has earned that right. My age and experience level are facts, not weaknesses. What matters is whether I can meet the standards required for successful completion of this program. The response was delivered in the same controlled tone she had used to deflect high school cruelty, but the context was entirely different. Here, respect was earned through capability rather than social conformity. Here, her unusual background was an asset rather than a liability. Staff Sergeant Williams studied her face for signs of false bravado or hidden uncertainty. He found neither. Instead, he recognized the same quiet confidence he had observed in the most effective operators he had trained over 15 years of military service. The technical training pushed every candidate to their limits. Advanced ballistics theory, environmental calculations that required mathematical precision under time pressure, and equipment familiarization with weapons systems most soldiers never encountered. His academic background proved invaluable as instructors presented concepts that challenged even experienced marksmen. At 2,000 meters, accounting for a 15-degree temperature drop, barometric pressure changes, and variable wind conditions. While other candidates struggled with the complex calculations, worked through the mathematics with the same systematic approach she had applied to advanced physics courses. Her ability to process multiple variables simultaneously impressed instructors who were accustomed to teaching through repetition rather than theoretical understanding. But technical knowledge meant nothing without the ability to apply it under pressure. The live-fire exercises were designed to simulate combat conditions that would challenge every skill they were developing. Moving targets, limited time windows, and environmental stressors that made precision shooting exponentially more difficult. During one particularly challenging exercise, candidates were required to engage multiple targets at varying distances while maintaining concealment from simulated enemy forces. The scenario combined advanced marksmanship with tactical thinking and physical endurance in ways that separated competent soldiers from elite operators. His approach to the exercise demonstrated everything her grandfather had taught her about the marriage of patience and precision. While other candidates rushed to engage targets quickly, she spent precious time analyzing the tactical situation and identifying optimal shooting positions. "Martinez, you're burning daylight," Drill Sergeant Jackson called. "This isn't a chess match." But understood something that experience would eventually teach the other candidates, that in precision shooting, hasty decisions led to missed opportunities and compromised missions. Better to take time for proper preparation than to rush into action without adequate planning. When she finally began engaging targets, her shots were methodical and devastating. each target eliminated with single shots that demonstrated perfect fusion of technical skill and tactical awareness. Her final score exceeded not just the other candidates but several program records. "How did you maintain that level of accuracy under time pressure?" asked Captain Torres, the senior instructor whose approval meant more than graduation certificates. "Captain, my grandfather taught me that pressure is just another environmental factor to account for, like wind or distance or lighting conditions. It affects performance only if you let it control your decision-making process." The answer revealed psychological sophistication that impressed instructors accustomed to working with combat veterans. Most soldiers required years of experience to develop such mental discipline, had internalized these concepts before her 18th birthday. Week 6 brought the psychological conditioning phase, designed to prepare candidates for the moral and emotional demands of precision shooting in combat situations. Unlike conventional infantry operations, where violence occurred in the chaos of close-range combat, snipers operated with clinical detachment that could be psychologically challenging. Dr. Sarah Williams, the program psychologist, conducted extensive evaluations designed to identify candidates who could handle the unique stresses of their role without developing long-term psychological problems. "Tell me how you feel about the responsibility of taking human life," Dr. Williams asked during his evaluation session. The question was carefully crafted to reveal attitudes toward violence, authority, and moral responsibility. Many candidates attempted to provide answers they thought the psychologist wanted to hear, but understood that authentic responses were more valuable than politically correct ones. "Dr. Williams, I don't feel good about the prospect of killing people, but I understand that in military operations, sometimes taking one life prevents the loss of many others. My responsibility is to be so precisely trained and mentally prepared that if such decisions become necessary, I can execute them with minimal collateral damage and maximum strategic effectiveness." The response demonstrated moral complexity that impressed Dr. Williams, understood the weight of lethal responsibility while maintaining the psychological framework necessary for effective military service. She wasn't driven by bloodlust or romantic notions about warfare, but by a mature understanding of duty and sacrifice. The final examination combined everything they had learned into a comprehensive field exercise that would determine not just graduation but future assignment opportunities. Each candidate faced complex scenarios requiring advanced marksmanship, tactical decision-making, and leadership under pressure. His final test involved a simulated hostage rescue situation with multiple variables designed to challenge every skill she had developed. The distance to target was extreme, environmental conditions were deliberately difficult, and time constraints created pressure that had broken candidates in previous classes. Through her scope, she could see instructors positioned to evaluate her performance. This single engagement would largely determine her military career trajectory. Success meant assignment to elite units with responsibilities most soldiers never encountered. Failure meant reassignment to conventional roles that would waste her unique capabilities. The shot required nearly 10 minutes of preparation as she calculated adjustments for wind, distance, temperature, and elevation. The target was partially concealed, requiring precision that left no margin for error. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the bullet traveled nearly 3 seconds before finding its mark. "Direct hit," confirmed the spotter. "Mission successful." The confirmation meant more than graduation. It meant acceptance into a community of warriors whose standards were absolute and whose respect was earned through performance rather than potential. That evening, Master Sergeant announced the final rankings. Had finished first in her class, earning not just graduation but recognition as the most technically proficient candidate in program history. "Martinez," he said during the closing ceremony, "in 20 years of training elite marksmen, I've never seen a candidate demonstrate your combination of technical skill and tactical maturity. You've set a standard that will challenge future classes. Standing at attention while receiving commendations from officers whose careers had been built on exceptional performance, thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the isolated teenager, mocked as gun girl, to graduate of the most demanding marksmanship program in the military. But graduation was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, real combat deployments where training became life-and-death reality. The girl who had learned to shoot tin cans off fence posts was about to discover what it meant to be a weapon in service of her country. The transformation was complete, but the real test was just beginning. How do you prepare for a war you've never seen in a country you can't pronounce? Stared at the mission briefing documents spread across her bunk, trying to absorb intelligence reports about Afghanistan that read like dispatches from another world. Tribal dynamics, terrain analysis, enemy capabilities, and rules of engagement that would govern her actions in a place where the wrong decision could cost American lives or create international incidents. 3 weeks had passed since graduation, 3 weeks of advanced training and equipment familiarization before deployment with Captain Tor's reconnaissance unit. The other team members were combat veterans with multiple deployments, men who spoke casually about firefights and improvised explosive devices like civilians discussed traffic and weather. Staff Sergeant, the team's communications specialist, had initially been skeptical about working with someone so inexperienced. His concerns were practical rather than personal. In combat, team cohesion could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Martinez, you've got impressive training scores, but Afghanistan isn't a shooting range. Everything changes when people are shooting back. The warning was delivered without malice, but it carried weight that understood completely. All her preparation had been conducted under controlled conditions with predictable variables. Real combat operations involved chaos, uncertainty, and consequences that training scenarios couldn't replicate. Sergeant First Class Jackson, who would serve as her spotter, took a different approach to integration. Rather than questioning her readiness, he focused on maximizing her effectiveness through intensive preparation and tactical education. Kid, you can shoot better than anyone I've worked with, but shooting is maybe 20% of what we do. The other 80% is fieldcraft, reconnaissance, and staying invisible long enough to take the shots that matter. Jackson's mentorship proved invaluable during their final preparation phase. He taught her camouflage techniques that went beyond anything she had learned in training, movement patterns that minimized detection, and survival skills that could mean the difference between successful missions and becoming casualties themselves. The flight to Afghanistan took nearly 18 hours, with stops at military installations whose names she couldn't share with family back home. Spent the journey studying intelligence reports and trying to prepare mentally for her first exposure to an active combat zone. Kandahar airfield was like nothing she had imagined. Dust, noise, and constant activity as personnel and equipment moved through the logistics hub that supplied coalition forces throughout southern Afghanistan. The base was a city of temporary structures and permanent-looking facilities that reminded everyone this conflict had been ongoing for over a decade. "Welcome to the sandbox, Martinez," Captain Torres said as they collected their equipment. "From now on, everything we do has the potential to save lives or create problems. There's no training wheels here." Their forward operating base was located in Helmand Province, an area where Taliban forces maintained strong presence and coalition forces conducted regular operations. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was coordinating attacks from somewhere in the region, but specific location information remained elusive. The base itself was a study in functional minimalism, concrete barriers, guard towers, and living quarters that prioritized security over comfort. The accommodation was a small room shared with female personnel from other units, a space that would be home for the next 6 months. Her first week was spent acclimating to environmental conditions that differed dramatically from training facilities in Georgia. The heat was oppressive, reaching temperatures that made equipment handling dangerous without proper precautions. Dust penetrated everything despite constant cleaning, requiring equipment maintenance routines that exceeded anything she had experienced. More challenging than environmental factors was adapting to the constant awareness that they were in an active combat zone. Incoming rocket attacks, though infrequent, reminded everyone that their safety depended on vigilance and preparation, rather than geographical distance from threat areas. "Martinez, you need to understand that everything here is different from training," explained Lieutenant Sarah Williams, one of the few other women at the base. "The stakes are real, the enemy is adaptive, and mistakes have consequences that extend far beyond personal failure." The warning proved prophetic during first patrol outside the base perimeter. What should have been a routine reconnaissance mission became a complex tactical situation when their vehicle encountered an improvised explosive device that damaged equipment and injured one team member. First exposure to combat medicine happened in the back of an armored vehicle, while Corporal Davis applied pressure dressings to shrapnel wounds that could have been fatal with slightly different placement. The reality of violence was immediate, visceral, and completely different from theoretical discussions in training environments. "This is what it looks like when things go wrong," Captain Torres explained during their return to base. "Equipment fails, people get hurt, and mission objectives change without warning. Your job is to remain effective regardless of circumstances." 2 weeks into deployment, intelligence sources identified a compound where high-value targets were believed to be meeting with local insurgent leaders. The tactical situation presented challenges that would test everything had learned about long-range precision shooting. The distance to target was approximately 1,200 meters from the closest position their forces could safely occupy. Environmental conditions included variable winds and temperature changes that would affect bullet trajectory in complex ways. More importantly, civilian presence in the area meant that precision was absolutely critical to avoid collateral damage. "Martinez, this is your first real-world engagement," Captain Torres said during mission planning. "Everything you've trained for comes down to situations like this. Are you ready?" The question carried weight that training exercises couldn't replicate. This wasn't about graduation or program completion. This was about eliminating threats to coalition forces while minimizing risks to civilian populations. The shot she would take could save American lives or create international incidents depending on its precision. "Sir, I've prepared for exactly this type of engagement. The conditions are challenging but within acceptable parameters if I can get accurate environmental data from the spotting team." Her confidence was based on months of intensive preparation, but understood that real combat would test every aspect of her training in ways that simulation couldn't anticipate. The target would be a human being rather than a paper silhouette. The consequences of success or failure would extend far beyond personal achievement. The night before the mission, called her grandfather using the base's communication system. Carlos had been following news reports about increased activity in her deployment area, and his concern was evident despite his attempts to maintain optimistic conversation. "Are you taking care of yourself out there?" "Yes, abuelo. The training prepared me well, and my team members are experienced professionals who are looking out for everyone's safety." "Good, but remember, all the technical skills in the world mean nothing if you don't trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." His advice proved valuable the next morning as they moved into position for what would be his first combat engagement. The approach required a 3-hour movement through terrain that provided excellent concealment, but also limited visibility of potential threats. Jackson, her spotter, provided constant environmental updates as they established their shooting position. Wind conditions were variable but manageable. Temperature was within acceptable ranges. The target area was clearly visible despite the extreme distance. Through her scope, could see the compound where intelligence reports indicated high-value targets were meeting. The buildings looked like countless others she had observed during training, but the knowledge that dangerous people were inside created psychological pressure unlike anything she had experienced. Target compound showing activity, Jackson reported quietly. Multiple personnel visible in the courtyard area. Stand by for target identification. The waiting began. Hours of maintaining perfect shooting position while remaining alert for the brief window when their target would be visible and stationary long enough for accurate engagement. This was the aspect of precision shooting that training couldn't fully replicate. The psychological endurance required to maintain peak performance readiness for extended periods. Movement in the main building, Jackson whispered. Individual matching target description approaching the courtyard. Range 1,187 meters. Wind northwest at 12, steady. Began her final breathing routine, slowing her heart rate and entering the focused mental state that had become automatic during months of training. The scope's crosshairs settled on the target as she made microscopic adjustments for environmental factors. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Years of preparation, months of intensive training, and weeks of deployment leading to this single shot that would prove whether she belonged among the elite marksmen who served in the most demanding operational environments. Target confirmed, Jackson announced. High-value individual stationary in courtyard center. You are cleared to engage. The trigger pull was smooth and controlled, followed by perfect follow-through as she maintained her shooting position to observe the impact. The bullet's flight time seemed eternal, though it lasted only seconds. Direct hit, Jackson confirmed. Target down, mission successful. The confirmation sent waves of relief and adrenaline through system, but also something deeper, the knowledge that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer a student or trainee. She was a combat-proven operator who had demonstrated the ability to perform under the ultimate pressure. During the extraction phase, Captain Torres approached her with an expression of professional respect that hadn't been present before the mission. Outstanding shooting, Martinez. You performed exactly as trained under conditions that challenge experienced operators. You've earned your place on this team. The approval meant more than any training award or graduation certificate. She had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her by men whose lives depended on her capabilities. That evening, as she cleaned her rifle and prepared mission reports, reflected on a day that had changed everything. She was no longer the girl they had called Gun Girl, or the candidate struggling to prove herself worthy of elite training. She was a warrior who had answered her country's call with precision and professionalism. But this was just the beginning. The mission that would define her career and establish her place in military history was still months away, waiting in the form of an intelligence report that would arrive on a cold February morning and present challenges that would push her capabilities beyond anything she had imagined possible. What happens when the impossible becomes your only option? The intelligence briefing arrived at 5:30 hours on a morning, when frost covered the base despite Afghanistan's reputation for oppressive heat. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried unusual tension as she addressed the assembled special operations personnel, her words creating ripples of concern among veteran operators who had thought they'd seen every possible tactical challenge. Ladies, we have located a high-value target responsible for coordinating major attacks against coalition forces. The tactical situation is unprecedented. The aerial photographs displayed on the briefing room's main screen showed terrain that made experienced soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. The target compound was positioned nearly 3 kilometers from any location coalition forces could safely occupy, surrounded by civilian populations that made traditional airstrikes impossible. Captain Torres studied the images with growing concern. 3,000 meters was beyond the effective range of most sniper systems, pushing into territory where atmospheric conditions became exponentially more complex and equipment capabilities approached theoretical limits. "Ma'am, are we certain about this distance measurement?" asked Master Sergeant Williams, whose 20 years of special operations experience included some of the longest confirmed kills in military history. The range has been through multiple sources. 2,996 meters from the optimal shooting position to target location. Environmental conditions include variable mountain winds and elevation changes that will complicate trajectory calculations significantly. Listen to the discussion with analytical detachment, processing the technical challenges while other team members focused on the apparent impossibility of the mission. Her grandfather's training had taught her that seemingly impossible shots became achievable when broken down into manageable components. The distance was extreme but not theoretically beyond the capabilities of their MRAD rifle system, with appropriate ammunition selection. Environmental factors would require careful calculation and real-time adjustment, but mountain shooting was something she had studied extensively during advanced training. "Colonel, what's the timeline for this engagement?" asked, her voice cutting through conversations about alternative approaches. "Intelligence indicates this target will be at the compound for approximately 6 hours before relocating to an unknown position. We have one opportunity to eliminate this threat." The timeline created additional pressure. 6 hours to move into position, establish communication with support elements, and prepare for what would likely be the longest successful sniper engagement in recent military history. Captain Torres understood the implications immediately. This mission would require every member of his team to perform at absolute peak capability under conditions that would challenge elite operators with decades more experience than his team member. "Sir," he addressed Colonel Mitchell directly, "my team can attempt this engagement, but I want to ensure everyone understands the challenges we're facing. The distance pushes our equipment to theoretical limits, and environmental conditions will make accuracy extremely difficult. Captain, this target has been responsible for attacks that have killed over 40 coalition personnel. If there's any possibility of eliminating him, we have to take it." The mission preparation began immediately. His rifle required configuration for maximum precision, with every component inspected and adjusted for optimal performance. Ammunition selection was critical. They would use match-grade rounds specifically manufactured for extreme long-range engagements. Jackson began analyzing data and topographical information to identify environmental factors that would affect bullet trajectory. The mathematics involved in calculating a shot at nearly 3 kilometers required computer assistance to account for variables that included altitude, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind conditions at multiple points along the projected flight path. "Bullet flight time will be approximately 4 seconds, Jackson explained during planning sessions. "At that distance, even slight target movement could result in a miss. We'll need perfect timing and ideal conditions." Staff Sergeant coordinated with intelligence assets to establish observation posts along their line of sight, providing real-time environmental data that would be essential for final shooting calculations. The complexity of supporting elements required for this single shot demonstrated how far beyond normal operations they were venturing. The movement to shooting position required an A-tower approach march through mountainous terrain that challenged even experienced infantry soldiers. Equipment loads included specialized ammunition, environmental monitoring devices, communication systems for coordination with multiple support elements, and survival gear in case extraction became complicated. Had never attempted a shot at this distance under any conditions, much less combat operations where failure could cost lives and compromise strategic objectives. During training, her longest successful engagement had been 2,400 meters under controlled conditions with perfect weather. The shooting position was located on a ridge that provided clear sight lines while offering adequate concealment and cover. However, the elevation difference between their position and the target area created additional ballistic complications that required mathematical precision under time pressure. Range to target, 2,996 meters confirmed, Jackson reported through his spotting scope. Elevation angle -12 degrees. Current wind conditions variable between 8 and 15 miles per hour from multiple directions. Began final equipment preparation, while Jackson coordinated with observation posts positioned along their line of sight. Her rifle had been zeroed perfectly during preparation phases, but environmental conditions at the shooting position differed from baseline calculations. Atmospheric pressure is lower than our baseline, Jackson reported. Temperature dropping, which will affect powder burn rates, will need real-time adjustments for changing conditions. The complexity of calculations required for extreme-range shooting was staggering. Bullet drop at 3 kilometers would be measured in meters rather than inches. Wind drift could push projectiles several feet off target if conditions weren't read perfectly. Even Earth's rotation became a factor at such distances. Through her scope, could see the target compound clearly despite the incredible distance. The magnification required for target identification created such a narrow field of view that any rifle movement resulted in completely losing sight of the objective. Target compound showing increased activity, Jackson reported. Multiple personnel moving between buildings. Standby for target identification. The waiting phase tested psychological endurance as much as technical preparation. Hours of maintaining perfect shooting position, while remaining alert for brief windows when their target would be visible and stationary long enough for accurate engagement. Personnel appeared and disappeared from the compound throughout the morning, creating false alarms and near opportunities that tested patience and concentration. Each potential engagement required complete preparation, followed by disappointment when targets moved before shots could be taken. Movement in main courtyard, Jackson whispered. Individual matching target description approaching central area. Standby for positive identification. Heart rate increased slightly as she prepared for what might be their only opportunity. The target would need to remain stationary for at least 10 seconds to allow final calculations and shot execution. Any movement during the bullet's 4-second flight time would result in mission failure. Positive identification confirmed, Jackson announced. High-value target stationary in courtyard center, range 2,996 meters, wind conditions northwest at 12 miles per hour steady. This was the culmination of everything she had worked toward since those first afternoons shooting tin cans with her grandfather. Years of patient preparation, months of intensive training, and weeks of combat operations leading to this single moment that would either establish new standards for sniper capability or represent a missed opportunity to eliminate a significant threat. Began her final breathing cycle, entering the focused mental state that had become automatic through countless hours of preparation. The crosshairs settled on target as she made microscopic adjustments for wind, elevation, temperature, and distance. Wind holding steady, Jackson confirmed. Target remains stationary. You are cleared to engage. The shot required absolute perfection in technique, timing, and environmental calculation. Squeezed the trigger with smooth, controlled pressure, following through with perfect form as the rifle fired. The recoil was substantial but managed, and she maintained shooting position to observe impact through her scope. At such extreme distance, she couldn't track the bullet's path, but Jackson watched through his spotting scope as the projectile traveled toward its target. 3.8 seconds later, the bullet found its mark. "Direct hit," Jackson confirmed, his voice filled with amazement. "Target down. Confirmed kill at 2,996 meters." The confirmation sent waves of relief and accomplishment through system, but also something deeper. The knowledge that she had just achieved something that would be studied by military historians and influence sniper training for decades to come. The record-breaking shot would eventually travel far beyond military circles, reaching the small Texas town, where former classmates would read newspaper headlines about achievements they could never have imagined from the quiet girl they had mocked as Gun Girl. But that afternoon, as she prepared for extraction from the mountain position where she had made history, Martinez was simply a soldier who had answered her country's call with precision that honored every person who had ever believed in her potential. The girl who had eaten lunch alone and endured years of casual cruelty had just proven that true strength doesn't announce itself. It simply performs when performance matters most. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts, creating echoes that reach places the speaker never imagined, touching lives they never knew existed, proving that the loudest voices aren't always the ones worth hearing. And sometimes, just sometimes, the girl they underestimated becomes the woman they'll never forget.